Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Or, well, actually, if anything, today we're doing more of a theory crafting edition rather than anything else, as today's primary subject, the Steel Confessors, their lore status is a pinch dubious. See, these guys were originally invented wholesale for a special event hosted by Games Workshop, or sponsored by them, I can't quite remember, but they first popped up in an issue of White Dwarf. That's when I remember seeing them way back. It's gotta be 2004, 5, 6, round about that period, I think, where they were created for a special event where they were participating in a very large Warhammer 40k battle, and if memory serves, this was long before the Apocalypse rules were introduced. So this big old super battle was simply just a traditional game of Warhammer 40,000, probably played out over the course of about 6 months, I'd imagine. That's the OG 40k rule system. Really did not lend itself very well to large-scale battles. It took a while to play, to put it mildly, but anywho, during this event, where the Steel Confessors were created, we know that for a fact, there's a full body-sized tactical marine and a bust of a Steel Confessors Terminator out there, so we know the Steel Confessors are real. However, supposedly a chapter-approved flyer with the Steel Confessors lore were handed out at this event. But to the best of my knowledge, nobody's actually been able to find one of these flyers since, and so their real lore background is possibly real, possibly canon, or simply just the highly successful result of somebody's overactive imagination. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, as the more interesting part of this is going to be the interactions between the Imperium and the Adeptus Mechanicus. But before we wander too far afield, let us begin with the lore for the Steel Confessors, as their origins is highly unusual. They were not created during any of the official foundings, you see. Instead, the Steel Confessors were created to be an Adeptus Mechanicus, Astartes force, with gene seed specifically donated for the purpose of creating a Mechanicus chapter of the Adeptus Astartes by the Iron Hands. Now, as we all know, the Iron Hands and the Adeptus Mechanicus have been very buddy-buddy for a very long time, so it's not necessarily as much of a stretch that they might do it, but to think that they would get away with it, now that's where the stretchiness comes in. But, again, before we wander off into the weeds, at some point in the 36th millennia, the Adeptus Mechanicus were launching an effort to retake the Barus system. It was home to several massive forge worlds and, even more importantly, long-lost research and development facilities. Obviously, the manufactorums in and of themselves were enormously valuable, capable of churning out vast quantities of weapons, munitions, and vehicles of war for the Imperium. But the development facilities, the testing ranges, the experimental laboratories, the various reverse engineering projects that most entrepreneuring forge worlds have going on at all times, that was the real treasure, as the Mechanicus wasn't entirely sure of what they'd lost. Beyond that, it was a significant quantity of knowledge, perhaps even STC templates. Unlikely that they would have left something of quite that value behind, but nevertheless, the fact that this system had been used for research and development, something relatively rarely openly sanctioned within the Adeptus Mechanicus, suggested that there was a treasure trove of data to be collected. On the flip side, however, was the fact that the system had been claimed by Chaos quite some time ago, and had been extensively fortified by its new master, the self-titled Overlord Barhoth. and he had dug in there like a blood tick, not only bringing along countless forces of mortal chaos worshippers in the form of cultists, renegades, and heretics, but also traitor legionnaires and Dark Mechanicus allies, into whose hands the Forge World had now undoubtedly been handed. This both meant that the Adeptus Mechanicus would face stiff opposition from their wayward kin, as well as, of course, the fact that if given enough time, these lost Forge Worlds would begin churning out weapons, ammo, and vehicles for the enemy, meaning that the system would be more difficult to retake every day that went by. And, of course, leaving the forgers in the hands of the enemy also increased the danger to the surrounding systems, as this now posed an existential threat both to, again, nearby systems and the Adeptus Mechanicus' presence in the area. A expeditionary force was hastily organized and dispatched to Baras. It would be led, of course, by the Mechanicus, who would provide the main strike force in the form of Skitarii regiments and a handful of Titans as well. They would also, however, need aid from surrounding Imperial Guard forces, with both standing garrison regiments being levied and fresh regiments being raised to take part in the Baras campaign. Despite all of these forces, however, or perhaps because of the hasty nature of their gathering, they did not meet with much in the way of success, barely any indeed. And soon the possibility began looming that the force might not only be halted, but entirely repulsed and routed, which would set back any further attempts to recapture the Baras system by probably decades, if not indeed centuries. Searching for a way to overcome the deadlock, the Adeptus Mechanicus dispatched a plea to one of their most ancient and faithful allies, the Iron Hands chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. The Iron Hands and the Adeptus Mechanicus have had close links to one another since the days of the Great Crusade, and the Iron Hands did not fail to respond, dispatching 3 clan companies, in excess of 300 Marines to the aid of the embattled expeditionary force. It soon became dislodged. With the aid of the Space Marines, it moved onwards towards the key world of the system, Baras III, the capital world and the main manufacturing. If it was seized, then at the very least the danger of the Dark Mechanicus beginning to export weaponry to nearby Chaos holdings would, if not indeed entirely, falter. With the enemy's supplies of weapons and ammunition beginning thus to thin out, the Space Marines and the Mechanicus could begin to move on to the various other planets and moons of the system, capturing them one by one, and thus isolating and draining the enemy's manpower and armory reserves as well, whilst continuing the campaign on Baras III, the capital world. It would take 5 years of non-stop warfare for the system to be largely back within the control of the Adeptus Mechanicus. With Baras III itself now withering on the wine, it would slowly but surely be reclaimed by Skitarii forces, whilst the Iron Hands clan companies were reassigned to deal with possibly the toughest nut of them all to crack: the planet Tarvor. This world was one of the principal reasons why the Mechanicus had moved so swiftly to retake the Baras system, as it was one of the largest developmental facilities in the sector, and its specialization, void shields, was obviously something that the Mechanicus were very, very interested in, as if its research bore fruit, this would improve the odds of survival for hive shields across the Imperium, for countless warships, and obviously, and most importantly, the god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the mighty Titans. Understandably, the adepts of the machine god were eager to retake the facility before too much of its information could be plundered or destroyed by its chaotic oppressors. It was also expected that the so-called overlord of the Barras system, Baroth, would also be located on this final world. It was, however, going to be a bit more difficult than the others. By and large, the other planets were blockaded by Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus warships, after which the Astartes led the forces down as the tip of the spear, and a ground campaign could begun immediately. Tarvel, however, was virtually covered in shields. Or, more accurately, every single location actually worth assaulting was shielded. The main manufactories, the research and development areas, and of course the spires themselves, and the countless weapon batteries down on the planet as well. Now, the weapons batteries would probably not be the biggest of issues, as the Imperium had significant advantage in the Void here, in essence full domination, and the only weapons that could slip out from beneath the Void shields and up into space would be anti-orbital torpedoes. These titanic weapons are dangerous, of course, but even a planet as heavily defended as Tarvor would only have a relatively limited quantity of these mighty behemoth weapons, as they required silos of enormous proportions, not to mention vast quantities of maintenance and expertise to keep operational, being usually very old and very fickle weapons. No doubt the Imperial commanders considered dropping the Iron Hands or their Imperial Guard and Mechanicus forces down on some of the outskirts of the planet, as there's no way the entire world could have been shielded, but doing so would have made them very, very exposed to enemy counterstrokes. And with so much of the world actually covered in shields, this ground force would not be able to be supported by the orbital forces. Not to mention that the Iron Hands would be somewhat wasted ground pounding. The decision was therefore made that the fleet would continue to pound the planet, until eventually the shields would undoubtedly buckle. There were dozens of warships up in orbit. Sooner or later, they'd make a hole. Although after weeks of bombardment, that theory was beginning to look a little bit thin. But then, finally, a rent was torn in the shields. There was now an opportunity. There wasn't a whole lot of time to consider. It could close again at virtually any moment. Ships were moved into position to attempt to widen it by striking infrastructure directly below the rent. But so as to not waste this precious opportunity, the Iron Hands immediately offered to launch an assault upon the planet. Now, this would be a dangerous endeavor, as they would need to go down there not knowing whether or not the shield mechanism was truly destroyed, whether or not the enemy could repower it and bring up the coverage of the shield again, which would leave the Iron Hands stranded and cut off. Not to mention the possibility of a trap, of course. But the venerable dreadnought Grixis, who had been placed in overall command of the entirety of the Iron Hands campaign in the Barras system, insisted that this was an opportunity that could not be lost. Not entirely sure of what they would actually find on the ground, however, an immediate drop pod assault could not be carried out, as, well, they didn't know where the drop pods would stop. They could hit, for example, an area of hive structure and just keep going through the hive for God Emperor only knows how many kilometers. A Thunderhawk deployment, therefore, was considered more practical. But as this would also mean that the Iron Hands might be heavily engaged by enemy aerial defenses whilst approaching, it was decided that the Iron Hands would throw caution to the wind and simply dedicate all 3 clan companies in a mass landing operation. 300 brothers, along with the venerable dreadnoughts, war machines, and support equipment, would all be brought down in one vast landing operation. It was a gamble, a massive one. But if successful, it would also mean the end of the campaign. Allowing no further room for doubt, Grixis led his brothers onto their Thunderhawks and began the descent. It swiftly became clear, however, that this had been a severe miscalculation on behalf of the venerable brother. As the moment the Thunderhawks began dipping a decent distance beneath the shields, they were met by an overwhelming blitz of anti-aircraft ordnance of all kinds. Flak kicked up by thousands of anti-aircraft cannons, and even homing missiles arcing up from cleverly disguised batteries all around the supposed rent in the shields. It seemed extremely unlikely that all of this could have been brought into position in the mere hours since the rent had been created. It was a trap. As when the general order to retreat was issued, trap having grown rather obvious at this point, all communication with the ships in orbit suddenly ceased. The only possible explanation for that was that the void shields had closed, leaving the Iron Hands with only one choice left: to turn their Thunderhawks back around into a booming dive and head for the planet's surface, where they might at least have a chance of living rather than being mercilessly butchered in the air or dashed upon the planet's shields. This, incidentally, being one of those inconsistencies that do make me doubt the story a pinch, because I'm pretty sure Thunderhawks can fly through void shields, but these are also experimental void shields, so perhaps they are hardened even against slower moving projectiles, or in this case, a transport ship. But no amount of pedantry is going to save our poor little Iron Hands, now trapped and completely surrounded by countless enemies on a planet in an area that was designed specifically to murder all of them. It didn't look good for the Iron Hands, not at all. Left back in orbit, the Iron Hands warships also understood this, and immediately sent communiques back to the main chapter, whilst also dispatching further astrotelepathic communications to the Adeptus Mechanicus and anyone that would listen nearby, as 3 full companies of Space Marines were about to be annihilated. The Iron Hands requested that the Adeptus Mechanicus, the only ones close enough to do anything, do everything in their power to rescue the force that had been sent to their aid. And for once, the Mechanicus actually responded. A rarity indeed, demonstrating the incredible bonds of loyalty and genuine fondness that exists between the Iron Hands and the Mechanicus. A rare term for both of these groupings, and yet, nevertheless. Several more expeditionary forces, along with every expeditionary fleet within range, hurried to the planet. Firstly, to add their weight of firepower to the bombardment of the planet's shields, as they were now back up again and blocking any further attempts to aid the Space Marines down on the surface below. As more and more warships arrived, even this world's mighty void shields began to blister and discolor underneath a relentlessly massive bombardment. At the height of it, over 500 warships, of varying tonnage, one must assume, everything from frigates and destroyers all the way up to Mechanicus explorator vessels and battleships, were hammering away at the shields. Obviously, they could not all shoot at the same spot due to, well, physics and the laws of reality, but it was hoped that if they could simply beat up every inch of the world, then the vast quantities of energy required to maintain such a shield would finally begin to falter. And it did. Under the titanic quantity of metal, of missiles, of lance battery strikes pouring out of the heavens, the shields broke. And, wary of another trap, this time, the Mechanicus would land with overwhelming force. Over 100,000 Skitarii, along with 4 warhounds, were dropped, with preparations for further forces to follow the moment it was confirmed that this was not another trap. As the initial 100,000 and the Scout Titans began to land, they immediately began moving towards the spaceport, where the Iron Hands were expected to still be, if any of them indeed lived anymore, as further waves of Guard, Titans, and Skitarii continued after them to expand the hold over Tarvor, and to begin hunting down the Chaos Warlord as well. After many unbearable days, the Skitarii reached the starport, where at first there seemed to be no hope of locating any survivors. Crashed and destroyed wrecks of Thunderhawks were scattered all over. Desecrated bodies of Iron Hands mounted on plinths, pillars, and pikes, in reverence of the dark gods that had apparently granted Baroth a victory here. The Overlord had dispatched overwhelming numbers against the Iron Hands, as he reckoned the rest of the world would continue to hold up against virtually any bombardment. Already nearly half of the Iron Hands' force had been destroyed simply heading towards the ground, blown apart within their Thunderhawks, or otherwise shot down the moment they tried to touch down on the planet's surface. Of the 174 Iron Hands that managed to actually get out of their transports, only 11 now live, all heavily injured and virtually at death's door. It would be easy to call it a meager victory, but it was a victory. And the Iron Hands had avoided the shame of having 3 clan companies wiped out. At least, not theoretically. And they were very grateful for the Mechanicus' ability and willingness to react so quickly and with such overwhelming force, risking tens of thousands of their own troops in the attempt to save even just these 11. It was supposedly this gratitude that led the Iron Hands to donating stocks of gene seed from their own personal stores to the Adeptus Mechanicus, expressly for the purpose of creating a Mechanicus chapter of the Space Marines. This, then, was the Steel Confessors, or at least so we are supposedly told. The supposed reason for this highly unusual and, make no mistake, very, very heretical action was to give the Mechanicus a rapid reaction force, a group of their own elites that they could send into combat to rescue similarly distressed Imperial forces like the 3 clan companies. I don't know about that. Again, I see why people doubt this particular little short story here, because one, the Mechanicus already, of course, maintain stores of gene seed on behalf of the various chapters. They do this both to continuously purity test the gene seed, to make sure that it is not falling prey to any mutation or disease or anything else, and secondly, to make sure that even if a chapter takes crippling casualties, that stores of gene seeds can then be made available to the chapter to rebuild, so that even if there is theoretically only a single brother left, the chapter is not actually destroyed and can still rebuild. The Mechanicus knows all of this because it's the ones keeping the stocks of gene seed. For the Iron Hands, then, to have enough gene seed on store to give to the Mechanicus, first and foremost, that's weird. One could also read it as in that they give permission for the Mechanicus to use stores of gene seed that they already possess. A pinch more logical, but even that would be a enormous act of incredible, remarkable generosity. Gene seed is the single most valuable resource in the entirety of the Imperium, and then, of course, we come to the obvious heresy of it all. The Iron Hands know that the Mechanicus can't make Space Marines. The Mechanicus knows the Mechanicus can't make Space Marines. And they both know that nobody can make Space Marines outside of an official founding, which can only be ordered by the Higher Lords of Terra. And so, what they set about doing, very, very secretly, everybody knew was wrong. But at the same time, the potential power of an entire chapter of Space Marines I gotta say, it's difficult to imagine the Adeptus Mechanicus, famed for bending the rules in their favor at every given opportunity, resisting that urge. And there was a chance they might be able to get away with it. After all, they could get all of their armor and weaponry produced by themselves. Nobody had to know, right? And hey, we've already established in Horror's Heresy canon that the largest warship ever built could be constructed within the solar system, and we can keep that a secret. Well, hell, let's take it a few steps further. We've already established in 40k lore that Belisarius Corp, the warp squirrel himself, would be able to construct facilities to not only make, but maintain in a state of suspended animation hundreds of thousands of Space Marines. No, super Space Marines all over the Imperium. So, with all that in mind, I feel like the Mechanicus might have looked at this and made the educated guess that, yeah, we can probably get away with this. Which, incidentally, they did not. For once, the Imperium's most holy Inquisition was actually awake and doing its job, and having discovered the existence of the Steel Confessors, immediately ran back to the Higher Lords of Terra, demanding that they be excommunicated, demanding that they'd be hunted down and killed as swiftly as conceivably possible. Lest the Mechanicus try to do this again. In this case, however, the Steel Confessors had already been in battle. They had already proven effective, and they had already proven loyal. Furthermore, the Mechanicus had not adorned their war gear with overmuch in the way of exclusively Mechanicus ideology and imagery, having made it clear that whilst the machine god, the Omnissiah, was obviously to be an icon of reverence for the chapter, it was simply in the form of the Emperor of Mankind. The God Emperor was still uppermost in the chapter's command structure, and next in line for their reverence was Ferrus Manus. At no point was it mentioned their loyalties lay, at least so far as the Inquisition could uncover, with the Mechanicus. Again, I'm wondering about that, considering the Mechanicus' proclivities for advantaging themselves over others, but very well. Thus, special dispensation was granted to the Steel Confessors to continue to operate, although they did have to sacrifice their connection to the Mechanicus. They would still be allowed to host Magi, as does all chapters, but they would need to swear to the God Emperor and to the High Lords before any of the Mechanicus, of course. How exactly, by the God Emperor's Gillespie bag, the High Lords of Terra expected to enforce that vow? A bit more dubious, but very well. The Steel Confessors were now a legitimate, recognized chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, and would go on yet again to prove very effective, if a pinch overzealous, having, amongst other things, been accused of wiping out an Imperial Guard regiment. Aye? Well, they didn't meet their objectives swiftly enough, which offended the Steel Confessors, who have taken the Iron Hands credo of the flesh is weak to its logical conclusion, and purging more than just their own bodies. The chapter has been under close scrutiny by the Inquisition pretty much for as long as it's been existed, but so far no pressing need to excommunicate them has apparently emerged, and I'm wondering if that can't be a little bit of a mistake. Then again, can you really argue that the God Emperor's Inquisition have the right, the sheer brass balls to lecture anyone on casually wiping out entire regiments of the Imperial Guard? I don't know about that. It's something that they tend to do rather frequently, honestly. But let's then address the big thing here, the theory crafting part of it. Namely, would the Adeptus Mechanicus do this? And, why? Well, their lust for power is probably the most likely explanation, because again, the Mechanicus would obviously know that even if the Iron Hands offered it, this was not a technically, theoretically legal thing for them to do by any stretch of the imagination. But it would give them an opportunity to see what they could get away with, as, again, 40k has a long history of various factions getting away with things that they should never realistically actually have gotten away with. And right now, there are definitely certain forces within the Adeptus Mechanicus that are not super happy about their current position, as whilst the Imperium is as reliant upon the Mechanicus as the Mechanicus is upon the Imperium, without the Mechanicus the Imperium cannot fight, and without the Imperium the Mechanicus cannot defend its worlds and all of its various supply chains. This is not something that many Mechanicus members are overly happy with, and the idea that their own Omnissiah is subservient to the Emperor, or simply just an aspect of him, well, there are darker parts of Mars where this is not viewed necessarily positively. And so if they could perhaps gain Space Marines of their own, which would probably be the single largest impediment to them ever trying to create an independent fiefdom or something like that, perhaps they could begin upsetting the power balance to the point where the Mechanicus could start calling the shot, rather than the High Lords of Terra. And I would not at all put it past them to plan a little bit of a coup like that, but they didn't get away with it. That's the key thing here. The Mechanicus didn't get away with their little Astartes chapter. And even if they, through a great deal of political maneuvering, no doubt, managed to not get them purged, and not get any massive consequences rained down upon their heads, they were still caught. And they were still, no doubt, placed under a great deal of scrutiny for any further attempts to pilfer the gene seed stores. So yes, would the Mechanicus do this? Oh, I believe so. Would they do so again? No. Although, I say that, but the Warp Squirrel Call has proved to the Imperium that not only can you hide away a tremendous number of Space Marines, you can even have them accepted by the High Lords, so long as you time their arrival well enough. So maybe the Steel Confessors are more realistic than we thought. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.